Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Lots of Dead Space, and in this video we are going to go over the best Resident Evil games to date. And I will be as spoiler free as possible for Resident Evil 8, so any footage with that will be just of a trailer. Most of these videos will be like that anyways, so just to let you know. So, to keep this video from being 40 minutes long, I decided to only rate the numbered entries in the series. So anywhere from Resident Evil 0, yes, that's an actual game, to Resident Evil 8, with the exception of one honorable mention that can be picked out of any of the spin-off Resident Evil games that were made. And there was a metric crap ton of them. That honorable mention will be revealed later in the video. A very high chance it will surprise every one of you. Also, I will be using the remakes over the original releases because in my opinion, they are superior games, but I will take into considerations the limitations of the games when they originally came out. So moving on from that, as a diehard Resident Evil fan who has many hours of experience in the series, I have constructed a Richter scale type rating system made specifically for Resident Evil games. It is basically constructed of 5 categories that are individually rated 1 through 10, making a perfect score a 50, and in each category, I went off personal experience and a little bit of research to refresh my memory. And this process took me about an hour and a half. That might not sound like a lot of time, but it was, especially for someone who knows the series as much as they do. I just wanted to make sure that every game was represented correctly. And when I say Richter scale, I mean exactly that. For instance, a 3 is quite a significant increase from a 2, and a 7 is still quite a bit better than a 6.5, so on and so forth. And in each category, I consider a 10 to be the best that a video game can offer so far. I will go into more detail about this later, but just to give you guys a rough idea of how I rated these games, here's a picture of the flashcard I made of all the games with the numbers obviously blurred out. I rated every game on each category before I moved on to the next one and then tallied up the total at the end. And I gotta be honest with you guys, the end result was beautiful. There was a couple of shocking results, but as I looked at the page longer, it was a perfect representation of my personal opinion on every game, and I think you guys will find it hard to disagree with as well. Now, with all that explanation finally out of the way, we could start the video and start with our number 9 spot. So our number 9 spot is probably the most obvious out of the entire lineup. It's going to be Resident Evil 6. And as you can see on my scale, it didn't add up very well. This was one of the very few times where I actually disliked the game before everyone on the internet started talking shit about it. I definitely don't think it's as bad as people say it is, but the criticism is definitely deserved. It didn't even feel like a Resident Evil game, and it was a spit in the face of fans of the series. They got ambitious to the point where it felt like they bit off more than they could chew. Nothing was original really besides the whole concept of the 4 campaigns. And as you can see, the horror aspect is really low on my scale, a 2.5. I would consider it scary to young children and or people that try their best to stay away from anything that would be horror related. On my scale, a 1 would include anything that would be considered creepy or spooky. A Resident Evil game by default is a spooky, creepy, kind of desolate feeling game. And honestly, the Leon campaign at the beginning at least was pretty spookified. And that's actually the only reason this got a 2.5. Too bad the rest of the game didn't follow in its footsteps, because returning to the T-virus was actually refreshing in an odd way, because after Resident Evil 3, everything was focused on parasites, tyrants, and super beings and stuff. Not saying that this was a bad thing, of course. Resident Evil 4 knocked everyone's socks off. I'm just saying that returning to the roots after all this time was actually really cool. Too bad the rest of the game didn't do this, because people might have liked it more. Luckily, we got the remakes, which definitely hit the spot. As for everything else, there was really no puzzles. It might have been like put a thing here and do a thing there. Nothing inventive. If anything, it would have been just stuff ripped off of the 5th game, and the story was suspect to say the least. The whole game felt like an Inception fever dream. And character design, I mean, you can't really hate it since it literally has every single character from Resident Evil that's worth a shit. But because Leon and Chris and everyone is there, it gets a 5. There was nothing new, and it just kind of felt like a cash grab. And that is why Resident Evil 6 is at the number 9 spot. So moving on to the number 8 spot, which would be Resident Evil 0. This game was pretty fun, though it definitely got held back on the overall game design. Definitely back in 2002, when this game came out, it was scary, but significantly watered down compared to Resident Evils 1 and 2, which came out 6 and 4 years earlier. Yes, 0 came out after 1 and 2. The fact that the game still had a fixed camera angle in 2002 really held it back. By this time, all 3D games had a player adjustable camera. And I know what you guys are gonna say. It's because it's more scary when you can't just turn the camera. But but that's not true, and it's been proven with many horror games afterwards. There's a certain creep factor to it, definitely, but the time for fixed angled camera games were long gone by 2002, so that definitely held it back. When it comes to character design, Rebecca Chambers is cute cop girl, and Billy Cohen is a sexy bad guy that girls apparently wanted back in the late 90s, early 2000s. They had a cool little dynamic going on between both of them. Wesker was in the game, but not really. The bad guys were not the greatest in the series, let's just say. The story was okay. It fleshed out how Umbrella had different branches and how each branch was conducting different experiments on the special plant they found in Africa that manipulates organic matter called Stairway to the Sun, which started this whole series. The specific branch that was focused on in this game was a branch under the control of James Marcus and William Birkin, who were testing the plant's DNA with leech DNA, thus the whole reason why the leech monster exists. And they were also experimenting on creatures like scorpions, spiders, snakes, and stuff like that, which is why a lot of the end-level bosses in this game were giant spiders, scorpions, etc. There's a lot more to it, but that's the gist of the game. It's definitely not bad, but compared to the rest of the series, it falls short, and that's why it gets the number 8 spot. The number 7 spot goes to none other than Resident Evil 5. A lot of fans were disappointed with Resident Evil 5. They felt like it was going away from what the series was all about, which was a good story mixed in with horror and fun game mechanics and puzzles, I guess. You know, as a Resident Evil fan myself, I'm not quite sure what it is about a Resident Evil game that I love so much. But if it doesn't feel right, I'll be the first person to tell you, if that makes any sense. I'm sure a lot of you guys at home will relate to that. That being said, there are some things I do know hurt Resident Evil 5, just like the lack of horror and lack of good game design. The whole game was just kind of a big Michael Bay movie. Not saying that Resident Evil games don't have a lot of action in them, because they do. They have a ton of action. Resident Evil 5, on the other hand, had too much action and almost had a Kane and Lynch syndrome going on, where it was so much that you kind of get desensitized by it after a while. One thing the game did pretty well was adding the second playable character. This was what gave it the extra gameplay brownie points, because I had a blast playing this with my boy Isaac. We probably beat this game 100 times back in the day. There wasn't a lot of split screen games back then that we liked, so we played this for months. We unlocked everything, all the cheat codes, weapons. We did personal challenge runs and stuff like that. It had a whole bunch of replayability with the added split screen mechanic, but on the other hand, a Resident Evil game doesn't really feel right with this feature. As much as I played this game, I knew it was a less desirable game. The story was solid, the character design was good. I mean, we got to play as Chris and Shiva, whom I really liked, and I hope we see more of her in the future. And we had Wesker. I mean, who doesn't love Wesker? A bunch of cool boss fights, and the puzzles were creative and different with the addition of a second person. Kind of like a terrible Portal 2, but basically besides the added split screen fun, everything was okay to mediocre. All in all, the game is good, but it doesn't hold a candle to the rest of the series, and that's why it's at the number 7 spot. At the number 6 spot, we have Resident Evil 7. This game was a great breath of fresh air compared to how terrible the 6th game was. It was nice to know that Capcom was actually listening to the fans. It took a hefty hiatus and reimagined their series, and they came back with this, the very first-person Resident Evil game. There's not much to say about this game besides it was a very decent game. Just like with 6, it didn't feel like a Resident Evil game. There was something about it. You know that feeling I was talking about earlier? This applies here. It was a good horror game, but that's what it felt like, a Capcom horror game, not Resident Evil. But that aside, the horror of this game was pretty good. Definitely scary at parts. It started off scary, and then halfway through it went to more of an action-based game. And it was interesting because the developer said that this was intended, because after a while you start to get desensitized by stuff. So he did a good job at changing gears to keep the game feeling fresh. I'd say the puzzles in this game were pretty dang good. I gave it an 8. I would consider a 10 in puzzles to be like Portal or Portal 2. This would be 2 tiers under that, which doesn't look like a ton on paper, but for my scale it's quite a huge difference. As for story, it was kind of okay. That's basically all I can give you. A lot of it was mystery, which can work with Dark Souls being a good example, but when you finally put all the puzzle pieces together of Resident Evil 7, there's just not a lot of meat on the bones. And when it comes to character design, all of the characters are original, I'll give them that. The Baker family, Evelyn, Mia, and Ethan, all original, but I just didn't like them. Not a single one of them. I didn't even like Ethan until the 8th game, which we'll get to eventually, but everyone in this game I don't really give a damn about. And then at the very end, Chris shows up and then credits. Look, I'm not saying it was bad, because it definitely wasn't. I did enjoy the game a lot, but it wasn't a home run like I was wanting. And I'm curious on how you guys feel about Resident Evil 7. Let me know down in the comments below, because I wonder if you guys feel the same way about this. For me, it wasn't the home run I was looking for, but you know what it was? It was a good step in the right direction. So that would be why Resident Evil 7 is at the number 6 spot. And at the number 5 spot, we have Resident Evil 3. There's not much to say about Resident Evil 3 besides it was a great game. It was scary, it was fun, lots of puzzles and intricate story crossroads. But when it comes to the story itself, it doesn't really add much to the series. It's happening during and slightly after Resident Evil 2. Though it did add the very intimidating and anxiety-inducing nemesis that is chasing you throughout the whole game, which definitely adds a huge amount of suspense and feeling of dread. Unfortunately, the Resident Evil 3 remake cut out a lot of the content from the original game, but don't worry guys, I'm going to add these cut parts in my ratings, and this is also another reason why the game is higher up. Really, the only downfalls this game had were story based. Also, puzzles weren't as great as in the first and second game. Resident Evil 3 remake is also less scary than Resident Evil 2 remake, but the original Resident Evil 3 release was considered terrifying, which bumps this stat up. Having that big bastard nemesis just come out of anywhere muttering stars the whole time and not knowing when you would see him next was truly genius. And he wasn't just a tyrant ripoff from the second game. He was mechanically different and implemented ingeniously to keep suspense and anxiety up at all times. Unfortunately, the Resident Evil 3 remake didn't capture the same feeling nearly as much. But like I said, not to worry guys, I am also considering the original releases for things that the remakes botched. And with everything implemented, Resident Evil 3 easily takes the number 5 spot. That may sound low on the list, but when you consider the rest of the games left in this list, it's a great spot to be at. And at the number 4 spot, we have Resident Evil 1, the game that started it all, I believe at least. It's hard to keep track with how batshit crazy this series is, but this game was groundbreaking. It was terrifying, implementing the new at the time fixed camera angle system, which was a genius way of overcoming limitations at the time. This was the same year that Mario 64 came out, so over-the-shoulder cameras that players could adjust were not heard of at all back then, and Capcom did a great job at temporarily fixing the in-game camera issue that 3D game developers were having at the time without the player becoming overwhelmed with the controls. Because that was a complaint that Mario 64 had back then, which sounds stupid nowadays, but these are people that only had 2D platformers beforehand. And an extra side effect of the fixed camera angles was, if done right, it can add a lot of suspense and dread to every room without having to do anything. And when it comes to scary, it was scary. Terrifying for the time. I wasn't even alive when this game came out, so I can't really give it a true rating, but after playing the remake, I can say with 100% certainty that this game was not a 10 out of 10. A 10 for horror on my scale would be games like Silent Hill 2 and more recently PT, which is the scariest games I've ever played to date. This game gave me nightmares as an adult, and that takes a certain level of sadisticness that Resident Evil 1 just doesn't have. But being 2 tiers under PT and Silent Hill 2 is not a bad place to be. As for the story, it was great, especially for the time. It had a lot of twists and turns, betrayals, mixed with confusion and mystery, and I'm taking the remake into consideration because the voice acting for the original release was, let's just say, absolutely awful. But I feel like the remake did a really good job at polishing the rough corners to where it didn't feel like a home movie. The design was beautiful. Having a maze-like mansion that leads underground and all around was a perfect way to have a compact game that felt expansive. All in all, this game does everything pretty good, though the controls even back then were not particularly loved. So that would be the only category where this takes a little dip in. But altogether, this is a hard game to beat, and it just so happens it was beaten 3 times, so that's why Resident Evil 1 takes the number 4 spot. And at the number 3 spot, I have Resident Evil 2. This game is absolutely fantastic. Everything that the first game did, the second one did better. And the newly introduced Leon Kennedy was immediately lovable, and who could forget about Claire either. And the remake for this game was even better in my opinion. It was so nice to see zombies become scary again, and in 2019, the Resident Evil 2 remake did just that, and they did a fantastic job with it. It was so nice to see Resident Evil back in its roots, even though it was just a remake of the second one, but it was one of the best remakes I have ever seen. It felt like a brand new game, especially because I never played the third and second game until the remakes came out. So for me, it was a new game. And honestly, the Resident Evil 2 remake is one of my favorite games of all time. Basically, everything's at an 8.5. The horror is a little bit less than Resident Evil 1. Mr. X kind of kills the mood. There's a lot of people that cannot handle the Mr. X chase scenes, but for me, it ruins all of the suspense the game was building. I would intentionally have Mr. X chase me the whole time, and you guys are probably asking why. Why the hell would you do that? It's because if you know where this guy is at all times, which would be right on your ass, the fact that he is much slower than you and easy to maneuver around, making it a lot easier to go around the prison and collect things. And for me, this just wasn't the best. I personally like the Nemesis way a lot better, where he would just come out in scripted events instead of actually just like RNG where he would just show up wherever the hell. Definitely the first half of the game is much more terrifying than the second half, but also maybe this was intentional to keep the game fresh like they did with Resident Evil 7. Personally, it drops a little bit for this, but it does make up for it in the dark parts of the police department and in the upstairs with the liquors and stuff. The puzzles in this game are fantastic, everything from the locker combinations to the weird statues and stuff that open hidden contraptions all over the police department just made you really wonder what the hell is happening, and it was all explained perfectly in the story to where it made sense. If you guys have the money, I highly recommend you get in this game. The Resident Evil 2 remake is more than just a remake. It's like a brand new game. As good as this game is, there's two that beat it, and that would be why this is at the number 3 spot. And before I give you the number 2 spot, I have an honorable mention. Out of all the Resident Evil game spin-offs, I have chosen Resident Evil Outbreak. Resident Evil Outbreak is a fantastic game, and it would actually have competed with the games that I have in this list. But to be fair, this game obviously can't compete. If you haven't played this game, there is a playthrough of people playing it on YouTube. I watched my sister back in the day play this game way back, and as a youngling, this game actually gave me nightmares, but that was just because I was 6 years old, but I couldn't stop coming back to watch what happened next. The game had many different ways of playing each and every level, giving a lot of replayability to see if you can do something differently that would help make up a lot of time and be more proficient. It was so fun, and it was so hard, and it's even hard for me to explain how good the game is in words. I would just suggest you guys check it out. If anyone there has had the pleasure of playing this game, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Here it is, guys. The point of no return. We have Resident Evil 4. Yes, that's right. The reigning king has been defeated. And obviously that leaves Resident Evil Village at number 1. And before you guys start disliking this video and trying to track me down to kill me, I want to explain why Resident Evil Village is in the number 1 slot. First of all, when I made this scale, I didn't know what was going to be number 1. I knew that there was 3 options. Resident Evil 4 I thought had the highest probability of winning, but then when I tallied up everything, believe it or not, Resident Evil 8 was a half a point better than Resident Evil 4. I'm not even shitting you. Resident Evils 8, 4, and 2 were all within 1 point of each other. And when I looked at it and I thought about it, I couldn't have picked a better way of dethroning the king. The reason that Resident Evil Village is so good is because of how good Resident Evil 4 is. Resident Evil 8 is literally a first-person Resident Evil 4. Shit, the only thing that would make this game even better is if Leon himself showed up, or if the original merchant showed up to chill with the Duke or something for like an Easter egg. Even in the concept arts, Ada Wong was supposed to be in the game. They cut her out early game development for unknown reasons, but that just goes to show you what they were trying to do when they made this game. They listened to their fans, guys. Capcom listened, and it is beautiful. Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil Village are so different, and yet at the same time they feel so similar. And I actually have a lot of experience in these games. I played Resident Evil 4 day 1, and I played Resident Evil 8 day 1, so I know what I'm talking about. Everything from character design, to horror, to gameplay, even the story, Resident Evil Village just tops 4 by just such a small margin. I would say the puzzles in Resident Evil 4 are much better. But besides that, Resident Evil Village wins in every single category. Let's go to the first category, horror. You guys out there that have played Resident Evil Village already know why I put this at a 9. I'm not going to spoil it because the game came out literally last week, but there is a reason. Don't get me wrong, Resident Evil 4 was scary as shit. Back in the day, Resident Evil 4 had me crapping my pants. I will never forget the chainsaw guy in the village, and who could forget the giant salamander monster in the lake. But when you guys look at the horror sections of both games, you can see that Resident Evil Village is just the scarier game. They added elements from Resident Evil 2 Remake, they kept the super suspenseful beginning that RE7 had, and then they did something genius. and something I personally hate them for, but they added a PT section to the game. And if you played this game, you know exactly what part I'm talking about. If you guys are curious and haven't seen it, on my channel, I did play Resident Evil 8 in its entirety, and if you watch part 8, you will see what I'm talking about. I titled it PT the game for a reason. Now, if you're wondering why I only gave it a 9 out of 10, here's the reason. It's just flat out because it's not as scary as PT or Silent Hill 2. These are the two games I have out of 10. Those games gave me actual nightmares when I played them, and that just wasn't the case with Resident Evil 8. They are just in two different leagues. But a 9 is not to be played with. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of people got to this part of Village and they just couldn't continue. It is truly scary, but it's just not nearly as sadistic or demented as Silent Hill 2 or PT. That's all I'm going to say. So moving on to gameplay, Resident Evil 8 is polished. It's more polished than RE7, but I wouldn't say it's as polished as the RE2 remake, but that's neither here nor there. The only reason RE5 got a 9 on gameplay is just because of how dang fun it is to play with a friend, and that's it. Just trying to clear everything up. So then when you move on to puzzles, I actually gave Resident Evil 4 the cake here just because it had better puzzles than RE8. So let's just move on to story. RE8 actually feels like a Resident Evil game. There's a lot of backstory, a lot of references to the past and what could be in the near future. It made me actually care about characters that I didn't even give a damn about in the 7th. I actually really liked Ethan at the end of 8, and I fucking hated him in 7. I even hated Mia even more. You can even tell this at the beginning of my playthrough of 8. I was glad that whatever happened to her happened, and then stuff happened, and I can't spoil it for you, but you get what I'm saying. So moving on to the last category, we have character design. Both games got a 10, but even though they are in the 10 range, I still think Resident Evil Village takes the slightest advantage. You can't beat Leon, that's just facts. But 8 made up for this everywhere else. Boss design, NPCs, even the merchant in 8 is better, which would have been considered blasphemy to me a month ago. Duke just plays a much larger role in the game than the one from Resident Evil 4 did in RE4. Resident Evil 4 was captivating, but Resident Evil 8 was breathtaking. That's two different things. They took what made Resident Evil 4 so special, added upon it, and that's why Resident Evil Village, in my opinion at least, is the new king. But also, my opinions are fact, so you're just gonna have to deal with it. All jokes aside, this was a super fun video to make, yet very time consuming, but it was worth it. Rating all the games was a blast, and until we get the next Resident Evil game, it looks like my job here is done. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, leave a like, subscribe, share with your friends, help the channel grow, and hit that bell to stay notified on all my new videos. And if you think I missed anything, please let me know down in the comments below as well. But I do believe I did a great job at rating everything fairly. If you agree, let me know also in the comments as well. And as always, I love y'all, and I'll see y'all in the next video.